Hello, my name is Cy Goodman. I'm a Regents Professor here at Georgia Tech, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our symposium on the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War in Europe. This will be the first of three sessions that we're having on three successive days, and today's session will be primarily concerned with the last year of World War II and how it ended and how it's going to actually transition into the second session that we're having tomorrow, which will be concerned with the state of Europe, 1945 through 1950. It is my pleasure as well to recognize that all of our sponsors, we have 5 sponsors for this, the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, and 2 of its constituent centers, the Center for International Security, Technology, and Policy, and the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies. And we're also hosted by the Atlanta Council on International Relations and supported by the Colonel Leslie Callahan Memorial Fund. And these folks have been with us through most of our 6 previous symposia, or 5 previous symposia. This is the 6th. This is the first online. The way we're going to work this is that 3 of us, starting with John Morrow, the Franklin Professor at the University of Georgia, is going to take the war up to the landing, the night before the landings at D-Day, June 6, 1944, and the Eastern Front to the very beginning of 1944. He's going to be followed by Woody Woodcock, retired Air Force colonel, now with Auburn University. And Woody is going to pick us up with D-Day and end with the first of the military surrenders at Reims on May 7th, 1945. And then I will pick up the Eastern Front from January 1944 through the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. And that will give us a natural transition to the second session tomorrow. And I point you to the playbill that you all have, or if you like, the flyer that's in front of you, that will give you the details on how those sessions will be broken up and the speakers. I'd also like to introduce you to Chris McDermott, who is the fellow, who is a research associate at the Sam Nunn School, and who is in charge technically of running this symposium. And the way we're going to work the Q&A at the end will be for each of you in the audience who want to raise a question or make a comment to click on the Q&A button to the far right of your screen and submit your comment or your question. And Chris will be filtering those, looking for responses, because each of you can also respond to the questions and either like them or augment them or what have you. And after the 3 of us finish our presentations, hopefully with at least 20 and maybe 30 minutes to go, we will take on those questions and comments and conclude this session. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to John Morrow. And John is going to take us all the way up to D-Day. John?
Thanks very much, Cy. It's a pleasure to be with you folks again. I consider myself the special invitee from the University of Georgia out in the boondocks outside of Atlanta. So as always, I enjoy being with you and with your audience. I'm sort of the setup guy here today in that I have to position Woody and Cy to proceed. So I'm obviously not going to be able to trace the whole war with you. Otherwise, I'd be here for 4 hours. What I am going to do is basically sort of suggest where the war is in 1943, 44, as we go towards the end. And I'm going to begin in the West with Southern Europe and Northern Europe, Northwest Europe, and then proceed to the Eastern Front at the end. Now, I'm sure you all remember that after the landings in Morocco, Casablanca, in November 42, and Montgomery having beaten the Germans back at El Alamein, and finally the Germans were all collected in Tunis in what some historians refer to as Tunisgrad, because we captured over 200,000 Germans and Italians there. That's a real unfair comparison to Stalingrad, because Stalingrad was a ferocious battle. Tunisgrad was due to Hitler's stupidity and dropping off some 250,000 men in Tunis, where they had no weapons, no supplies, and therefore simply surrendered to the Allies and were carted off into the life of POWs in England and in the United States. And of course, then we moved on to Italy. The Italian campaign after Sicily and Italy, one often has to wonder, I still do, I have some concern about Winston Churchill's sense of topography, because just as at Gallipoli, he was the one that kept saying Italy was the soft underbelly of Europe and we should be able to strike right up through there. And the only problem is Italy has this series of mountain ranges that cross Italy, and we literally were fighting our way uphill all the way to the very end. I've actually traveled the peninsula and traced the battles, and it's almost frightening, especially when you get to Monte Cassino, when you're driving up and you see this huge mountain with this. They've repaired the priest, the huge abbey there, but it looms over everything, and you can't get around it. And so we're stuck there for quite a while. The Gothic lines, all of these are very difficult. And I should mention that the Italian front is actually the most diverse front of all, because we have everyone from African Americans, Americans, Poles, Indians, British, everyone's there. And I also should mention that the Poles had a furry combatant who was a bear. And anyone who went to visit the Polish units, in fact, their cemetery ultimately is the closest to the top of Cassino because they took it. Anyone who went to visit them would suddenly encounter this very large bear, which terrified them all. But it turned out the bear was an artilleryman, because the Poles used the bear to carry artillery shells back and forth. So we should note the bear as an outstanding feature of the Italian War, because otherwise it's pretty bleak. And as we know, the landings, Anzio and so on, trying to flank the lines, we finally broke through. And then Mark Clark, my friend Rick Atkinson, who's a noted American historian of the war, always refers to Mark Clark as Marcus Aurelius Clarkus, because of Clark's always harking back to his Roman nose and so on. But Clark, when faced with the prospect of either seizing Rome or doing what he should have done and cutting off the Germans' retreat from Monte Cassino, chose to seize Rome for the huge press splash that it would make. And of course, he took Rome on June 5th, 1944. Unfortunately for him, short press impression, as we know from what goes on in Northwestern Europe. Now, in Northern Europe, because we're going to be fighting in Italy through the rest of the war, Churchill's going to say, why don't we go into Yugoslavia? Well, that's mountainous too. The question by 43, the end of 43, is we know we're going back onto the continent. We have persuaded the British after much discussion. In fact, some of the latest works on Winston Churchill and the British indicate that Churchill really, and his chief of staff, Alan Brooke, really probably never would have preferred to go back on the continent in Northwest Europe, another bloodbath, as what had happened in World War I. So it's the American pressure that does that. And of course, we've got to soften up Northern Europe first. So we may be slow in creating what Stalin wanted, which was a Western front. Italy is not good enough. But the air campaign against Germany, the night waged by the Royal Air Force Bomber Command, and the day waged by the 8th Air Force out of England, and then out of Italy, the 15th Air Force going into Southeast Europe, is reaching a height the end of 43-44. We have been through a very difficult period. The October raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt were disastrous. We lost 60 bombers in each of those, and 60 bombers means each one carries a crew of 10 men. We could not sustain those losses. But by the end of 43, beginning of 44, we're receiving the plane that's going to change the air war. And that's the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang had been around, equipped with an Allison engine that was only good at low altitude. Matched with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, Spitfire engine, it becomes the superb Allied fighter of the war. Packard actually manufactured most of the Merlins, but the main thing was that it could fly long enough with tanks to reach Berlin and back, or even participate in shuttle raids into Russia, which meant that finally our bombers were going to have the protection they needed. And as of Big Week in early 1944, we went after the German aircraft industry and the German Air Force, basically to destroy it in the air. And so by 1944, middle of 1944, we have air superiority over Europe, and most specifically over the Channel and over the D-Day beaches. As to where we're going to land, it was settled that we would land on the Cotentin Peninsula, where Normandy is. We had weighed a number of other things. I think one of the trial runs that is better left forgotten, but I'm going to mention it, is the invasion of Dieppe in 1942, because people like to forget it. I have no comprehension except for the fact that there was 6,000 Canadians who had been in England since 1939 and really did want to fight. Why in the devil anyone would have attempted to land at the port of Dieppe? They botched it in the sense that the landing fleet encountered German patrols the night before they landed. The British did not have aerial superiority. And anyone who has ever been to Dieppe, you understand that it is a small port surrounded on three sides by high cliffs, all of which contain German guns. And there's only one small exit from the port, which the Germans had bottled up. And so the Canadians basically lost half their force, either killed or captured. And the British came away saying, well, it looks like we won't try to land in a port. Well, as far as I'm concerned, they didn't need to try Dieppe to figure that one out. That was an absurd loss of men. But in going to the Cotentin Peninsula, you had 50 miles of beach with some towns there. And so the planning proceeded under Cossack, General Frederick Morgan, and then the commanders were assigned, and the British and the Americans and the Canadians were designated their beaches. And we have this incredible armada. One of the key things is you have to have the landing craft. We had assembled the landing craft. There was always a shortage of landing craft. But when you witness the size of the armada that sails from England, you realize that the United States in particular has this incredible logistical ability to project force all the way across, well, not just the Atlantic, but the Pacific as well. And the British are very clearly important. They come up with a number of things. The Pluto, which is going to be the undersea oil pipeline that we'll need to supply, plus a number of inventions for the landing. So this is the greatest amphibious undertaking at that point of all time. And you just realize as you see the ships leaving port. And of course, Eisenhower has to make the call, and Eisenhower deserves a lot of credit because he wasn't one of those people who would put it off on someone else. When he made the call to go in on June 6th, and it looked as though the weather would break, he wrote a letter stating he took full responsibility. He had visited the paratroopers the night before. He was a general who was sincerely concerned with his men. And so this was it. Now, I want to spend the rest of the time on the Eastern Front because we often forget just how significant the Eastern Front was. And I think the best way to summarize significance is to recall that 8 of the 10 German soldiers who were killed in World War II were killed on the Eastern Front by the Soviet armies. Furthermore, at no point in time during the war did the Germans have any fewer than 2/3, usually 3/4, 2/3 of their soldiers, of their armies on the Eastern Front. Eastern Front was Hitler's war from the very beginning. He began in Poland, dividing it up with the Red Army because Stalin's Nazi-Soviet agreement in 1939 enabled Hitler to go west after Poland. But Hitler, from the very beginning, had always planned to invade Russia, and as the plans developed, this is going to be a war of annihilation. He was not only going to murder all the Jews that he found, his armies were going to starve to death some 20 to 30 million Soviet citizens, so that once they took the Caucasus and the oil and the grain in that southern region around the Black Sea, they would simply use that to feed Germany and reduce the Slavic peoples to slavery. And we know now that one of the ways that Hitler paid his top generals was to give them these huge estates out on the Eastern Front where they could bask in luxury once they won the war. Now, I'm not going to try to go over the entire Eastern Front, but just remember in a nutshell, at the beginning of the war with Operation Barbarossa, the Germans launched 3.5 million men, including their allies, east. And the Russians were caught unprepared. Stalin had spent the last 3 years purging his army command. A number of the really brightest generals, some of the creators of the Red Army and their notion of deep operations, tank operations, which was far more sophisticated than the German blitzkrieg, he'd murdered. And the Germans, in a sense, overestimated their position because Stalin's army had not performed well in Northern War against Finland from the fall of 39 to March 40, although they won the war, but it was a disastrous performance. So the German army logically figured they were going to be in Moscow and end the war probably, maybe a good 7 or 8 weeks. Their problem was that the blitzkrieg as executed in France. There was no blitzkrieg in the Polish War initially, but the blitzkrieg in France was a very small affair in terms of distances you had to cover. As you go into the Soviet Union, you are entering a front of some 1,000 miles in length and actually 1,000 miles across, because it gets bigger as you go in. And Hitler and his generals were still arguing about where to go. But the crucial point was that they needed to penetrate into the Soviet Union far enough to round up the Soviet armies. And they may have captured more than 3 million prisoners, most of whom died in the camps. But the Russian army had an advantage the Germans did not realize. The German intelligence service in the East underestimated the size of the Soviet army by 50%. It is one of the greatest intelligence failures in history. So that in the initial accounts of Barbarossa that we would receive, usually from the German perspective, everything went beautifully until suddenly the winter occurred at Moscow and boom, they were stopped there. Point of fact, all the latest accounts indicate that the Germans were having problems all the way, because while some of the Soviet units were surrendering, a good number of them, some of them were fighting to the death. And this had not happened on the Western Front. The other thing was that logistically, the Germans were simply not prepared for the depth of this invasion. The high command always downplayed logistics, thinking will could conquer everything. But the tanks were breaking down, the men were breaking down. They didn't have enough trucks to be able to move their men of a standard type. And so we know now that Barbarossa was having problems long before it got to Moscow. And Moscow, the Germans had basically run out of steam in view of the Kremlin. And the Russians simply took all of about 500, 750,000 men from the east, where the Japanese had gotten a bloody nose in the battle in Korsengol, which is what the Russians called it, in 1939, and he sent them all to Moscow. And all of a sudden, the German army finds itself under assault and being pushed back by all these new forces they didn't expect. Some historians now think that Moscow is a crucial turning point. And after that, the Germans would never have enough to beat the Russians. I do not believe that to this day, because in 1942, in the spring and summer, Hitler's off on campaign again, and this time they're headed for the Black Sea area and to try to capture the oil and the grain of the Caucasus. But in heading south, he makes a crucial decision that instead of concentrating on the south, he's going to split his forces, and he's going to send the Sixth Army to Stalingrad to capture it on the Volga River, initially supposedly to protect his flanks, but then ends up making it a battle over the city named after Stalin, after Stalin had been its political advisor in the Civil War in 1919. And this is a very, very wonderful book now by a fellow named Jochen Hellbeck, who's a German prof who teaches at Rutgers, which deals with Stalingrad based on all new accounts and original accounts from the Soviet army as the city that broke the back of the Third Reich. Because what happened was, as the Germans got more involved in Stalingrad and sucked in, Trikov, who was the commander of the 62nd Army, basically was told to hold them there. And they held, it was a bitter fight, but while they're holding, Marshal Zhukov planned this encirclement of the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. And so fighting there since August, all of a sudden in November, the Sixth Army finds itself completely surrounded by the Germans and unable to, when they finally decide to break out, they can't do it. The Germans bottle up an entire army, which surrenders in January 1943. 55,000 men are left to march into captivity. 5,000 return home in 1956. This is the crucial point because after this, Soviets will be on the offensive. Battle of Kursk, which is a major tank battle in which the Germans decide they're going to batter their way and crush a Soviet penetration into their lines. Turns out to be a disaster, and Hitler has to break it off. The Tiger tanks are breaking down. The new Panthers are not doing very well. But furthermore, because of what's going on in the West, he decides, well, maybe he'd better cut his losses and move some of those Panzer troops to the West. In 43, this is the summer in July, and so he does, thinking about what's going on in Italy. But the game is up, and from then on, the Soviet armies are going to push west. So what we see is that the Russians are moving west. We have air control over the channel. Our forces are ready to go. We have Rome, but we miss capturing all those forces that escaped from area around Monte Cassino. And the question is, how long is it going to take us to try to finish off a Germany that is determined under Hitler not to surrender unconditionally? They know they have created monstrous crimes. They have, as Goebbels told his population, we will either go down in history as the greatest victors or the greatest criminals. And so the Germans are up against it, and it's going to be up to them to see how long they survive. Woody Woodcock, all yours.
Thank you, sir. First slide, please. Slides are coming up. Well, while Chris is working on that, I'll go ahead and get started. I've entitled my portion of the talk today, From the Beaches to Berlin. And where I'd like to pick this up from Dr. Morrow on the Western Front is D-Day. Basically Operation Neptune, which is the beach landings, which secure a toehold, not necessarily the foothold we had hoped for, on the continent again, and take it through the 7th of May and General Jodel's surrender, unconditional surrender at Rens. It is difficult to start any talk about the Second World War without a quote from Churchill, which I have on the first slide here. And what you find as the Allies are preparing for the beach landing is that they have finally created enough mass, enough combat power for them to believe that they have the tools to finish the job. And that's kind of where we'll pick it up. So it has taken 2.5 years for the Allies to reestablish themselves on the continent. And it will take them another 11 months from the beach landings to VE Day, which is the 8th of May, 1945, to push and come to what we now consider the final victory in Western Europe. Slide, please. So thematically, three themes I'd really like to touch on today as we go through this as food for thought. The overarching piece of my discussion, I think it's important to couch this final push in terms of the idea of total war. The idea of total war is worthy of its own lecture in and of itself, but I think the three pieces of that I really want to talk about total war requires total effort. And what you see in terms of the coalition that prosecutes the final 11 months of the war is it was a coalition. There was not a preordained alliance that existed between the three major powers that came together for the final push. So within that, you have some friends, you have some rivalries, and ultimately you have some allies. But within that, there are frictions. There are different ideas on how to prosecute the war. There are different ideas on political aims and means. And each of those make coalition operations, and certainly the last 11 months of the war, it adds another layer of difficulty to this. The second theme is violence and military efficacy. Even as the Allies get ready as they prepare Normandy for the beach landings, they find themselves having to, invoking the transportation plan, to drop weapons in civilian areas. And you'll see as we go through this, and I'll talk about this a bit more when we get to the bombing of Dresden, civilians become more and more a part of the targeting consciousness of the Allies as they go forward. And then the final theme is really preparing for peace. And this is something that will be covered in the future days here, but something I'd like to touch on because it also bears on how the end of the combat operations in the theater are brought to a close. And vision plus vision is division, and you'll begin to see that as the Allies start their offensive in D-Day. Stalin's been waiting for this for quite a long time. They've been promising it to him, and it's the threat of Germany is a unifying force. But as we get closer and closer to what becomes the final peace on the 8th of May, you begin to see these cracks in the alliance, particularly in different visions of what the post-war world should look like. So with that in mind, we'll go to the next slide, please. Timelines, I hesitated putting the timeline up because timelines tend to add a level of placidity to events. And obviously, for my talk today, we'll start with the 6th of June and the D-Day landings, and we'll finish actually on the 7th of May with General Yodel's surrender. And in between that, you have a very nice and linear progression of events. But in between the bookends of D-Day and the 8th of May, or the 7th of May, it is anything but. So we'll talk about the D-Day, we'll talk about the breakout, some of the liberation of Paris between the 19th and 25th of August, and some of the issues that arise within the alliance itself, particularly in this case, the reinsertion of France into the alliance. Market garden is important in terms of setting up for the Allies the fact that Germany is more than capable of still defending itself. Tolstoy Conference will be talked about tomorrow. But when we talk about the Battle of the Bulge, again, we'll talk about not only the battle itself, but particularly some of the issues that led to that actually happening. Then the bombing of Dresden, and we'll try to address some of the issues with regards to civilian casualties and civilian targeting. And then it is difficult to talk about this phase of the war without talking about the Holocaust. In this case, we'll focus on Buchenwald and the American liberation of that camp, but also what it meant in terms of being a moral punctuation point in the final campaign. The death of FDR looms large in this as well, the battle for Berlin, and then we'll move on to the end of the conflict in the West. Slide, please. So as Dr. Morrow's already done, it's important to keep Overlord in context and from two perspectives. One, we tend to, as we sit here now and look back on it, think of it as almost an inevitability that Overlord will be launched and that it will be successful. And neither of those two is actually true. The debate over how to reinsert forces back into and back onto the continent was a very lively one between the Americans and the British. As as Dr. Morrow talked about, the British tended to, particularly Winston Churchill and his chief of staff, looked to the indirect route through Italy, particularly as the successes over there in the aftermath of Husky and the Anzio landings, as there began to be create some momentum in that theater. It was easy for Churchill to try to continue to push his point with regards to the efficacy of coming at Europe through its soft underbelly. But again, the topography, and more to the point, I think the desire for the United States to directly engage with German troops really reoriented the thinking so that through the planning process, Normandy became more and more of a certainty. And certainly in terms of the number of troops that were being offered by each country, the United States was put forth the preponderance of those. General Eisenhower is selected as a Supreme Allied Commander, and probably one of the finest selections of the war for many reasons, not the least of which was his ability to not necessarily placate, but get harmony out of the friends and rivals that really made up the command structure that would conduct the Normandy operation in the west of the rest of the operations in the west. Couple things to think about with regards to the beach landings on the 6th. First and foremost, very courageous decision on General Eisenhower's part with regards to he had delayed it from the 4th because of weather. There is a small window of opportunity weather-wise, so he decides to launch the Normandy landings on the 6th of June. And as you look at the upper right corner of the slide, you look at the different phase lines with regards to progress of the Allies coming off the beaches. And the blue lines represent really the first day. In reality, what was supposed to happen is something more akin to the purple line. And so rather than a foothold being established by the 7th of June, what you really have are some toeholds that are pretty tenuously held. The concern at this point is that aligned against this or arrayed against this, and the Allies were well aware of this, were 10 German divisions that, had they been cohesively used and given those small pockets, could potentially have thrown the entire invasion back into the sea, which is what Rommel had intended. But Hitler, being Hitler, had decided to parse up his forces so that by the time the landings were made, there was not a unified command structure with which the Germans could rally their forces and create that counteroffensive that would have pushed them back into the sea. So that said, the Allies established this, but at a very high price. If you look at the numbers for Overlord, they're fairly staggering. Second British Army is 83,000, Canadian losses 18,000. 57,000 overall wounded, not almost 10,000 missing, and it is anything but a walk ashore. And if you've ever stood on the beaches of Normandy, it is difficult to imagine being a soldier hopping out of a landing craft and about to assault what were essentially very well fortified positions. And as the slide says, no plan survives first contact, and that was certainly true with Normandy. Slide, please. So returning to the theme of potentially lost opportunities, if you ever read Winston Churchill's memoirs of the war, this is a theme that he continually comes back to, particularly in the 4th volume called Triumph and Tragedy. But in his mind, he still thinks, or still thought when he wrote those, that this was a missed opportunity. And what he was talking about can be, as you look at the upper left corner of the slide, is this presents anyway as a very short distance into the heart of Germany. But as Dr. Morrow rightly pointed out, one of the largest issues with this would be the terrain. But the other piece of this is because we have the Allies have the tools and the weapons they need to conduct the war. but they're still in finite numbers. So in order to attack, there has to be a reallocation of landing craft, and landing craft become the critical piece of not only Overlord, but all operations. And again, you've got to back out context-wise and look at this section of the war in context, and that at the same time that these are being debated, you have the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, and Admiral King owns a lot of landing craft as well that he's not necessarily willing to give up. So there's a finite number of these, and part of the planning process for Overlord was another operation called Anvil, which was supposed to be launched nearly simultaneous to Overlord to try to relieve pressures on the beach, basically establish two fronts, draw off the German reserves, and facilitate the reestablishment of a foothold on the continent. Well, as time goes on, Anvil gets slipped and isn't actually launched until 3 or 4 weeks after Normandy. It's renamed Dragoon, and has little of the effect that it was originally intended to, hence reinforcing, potentially anyway, Churchill's argument that Italy and the Mediterranean represented a missed opportunity in this. Slide, please. So as the Allies break out of the beach, Normandy itself, the breakout of Normandy and Operation Overlord was a 77-day operation, and toward the end of that 77 days, we come to the conundrum that is Paris. Eisenhower's original conception was to actually bypass Paris. He had no desire to get into a street fight with the Germans in a city like Paris. At the time, Paris was being held by roughly 20,000 German soldiers, and Eisenhower was more concerned with getting his forces east and potentially cutting off a German retreat to the now mythical redoubt in Bavaria. But politically speaking, a couple of things go into Eisenhower's decision process, not the least of which is de Gaulle. Paris, in and of itself, really represents the reintegration or the re-injection, as it were, of the French military, the French Free Military, into Allied operations. Until this point, the only French opposition fully functional within France until the landings is the resistance. So in Paris, though, what you now have, and the conundrum that sets up, is you really have three different visions of Paris. You have the French resistance, which tends to be communist in nature. You have the Free French, who have every intention of reestablishing France outside of a Vichy regime. And then you have the Allies, who have the intent of, once France is captured, essentially to govern France until they're ready to give it back to the French. And this all culminates in Paris. And after 4 years of turmoil, 4 years of occupation, needless to say, the French people and the resistance within Paris is getting fairly impatient. They begin to strike. They begin to foment turmoil in there. And the immediacy of this problem comes to a head as the Allies essentially come closer to Paris, and Eisenhower then decides to enter, decides that it's time that to liberate Paris. Part of this is also driven by the fact that you have General Leclerc and the Leclerc division, who is more than willing to disobey orders at this point, and in fact does with his assault on Paris, the way that he assaults Paris, and go it alone. So there's several factors, but it's a fascinating study in coalition operations, in political considerations, and certainly a classic example of the competing ends and means that Eisenhower is having to deal with as he conducts this final push to victory. Slide, please. So finally, after Paris is liberated, the strategic question becomes how best to prosecute the rest of the war. And there are really two schools of thought, one represented by General Montgomery, and he believes a massing of troops of all of the forces available to the Allies into a single push directly at the heart of Germany. Eisenhower is more than aware of the defensive capabilities of the German military and also their ability to counterattack, and is more inclined to launch an offensive on a broad front. And what ends up happening is, as this front is pushed forward, it begins to spread. Now you've got the 3rd Army in the south under Patton. You have General Hodges and 12th Army Group under Bradley, and in the north you have the 21st Army Group under Montgomery, and they are essentially tasked with not necessarily different objectives, but fairly wide-ranging objectives. Monty's objectives initially are to the Dutch coast and taking care of the weapons that are continually raining down on London. And Eisenhower is trying to push Bradley to the east again to enter basically through the Saarland and begin to cut the possible lanes of retreat from Berlin to the southern redoubt. So once the initial strategic question was answered, and that was answered fairly clearly with Eisenhower, you have the spreading of the front. And now Hitler, being Hitler, sees this open up. And what's interesting is that the Allied intelligence, and some historians have called this probably the second greatest failure of military intelligence since Pearl Harbor, failed to see that he has pulled some of his primary units off of the front line, is refitting and rearming them, in particular the 6th Panzer under Sepp Dietrich, and is massing them for an attack. And he's chosen the seam really between the two Allied forces, between Montgomery's forces in the north and Bradley's forces in the south. And it's about a 70-mile line that's only held by a single division, 106, and these are fairly new and green troops. So that when it's initially launched at 5:30 in the morning on the 16th, it is nearly a complete surprise. As you read some of the memoirs of the general officers, part of Eisenhower's decision making was to accept the possibility of an attack. What is a complete surprise to them is the violence and the amount of combat power the Germans are able to assemble for the attack, and as such, the initial penetration is fairly deep. And everyone is familiar with the Battle of Bastogne and the holdout there. But what is less talked about really is the Allied reaction to this, how quickly they were able to assess just the significance of this thrust, but how quickly they were able to react, strengthen the shoulders of it, and eventually start to squeeze this pocket, and eventually, by the 25th of January, have repulsed the Germans. But one of the most significant pieces of this battle really comes from the German side of the equation, and that is no one other than Hitler, no one on his command staff had any desire to launch this, because all of them realized, Rundstedt in particular, that this was an all or nothing gamble. This was Hitler's final card. This would be the final offensive. After this, there would not ever be a chance, at least on the Western Front, for the Germans to ever take up the offensive again. And this would be now very much a defensive war for Germany, and that's essentially what it becomes. Next slide, please. So as the Allies progress across the West and into Germany, the bomber offensive continues. And one of the major questions that came out of this, and this has been studied and debated ad nauseum, was not only the efficiency of the bombing campaign, but also its efficacy. And one of the most poignant parts or points of discussion in that has to be Dresden. Dresden was a cultural center in eastern Germany, and was also very much an industrial center. And Bomber Harris, the commander of Bomber Command, in his willingness to bomb really civilian targets, targets Dresden because of both of those factors. The first one being what he would like to do is break the will of the people there, but really slow down the production, war production for Germany. So what you have with Dresden, when Dresden is launched, is initially when the bombers come overhead, they drop a mix of incendiary and high explosive weapons, which start the city ablaze. And they're actually targeting the center of the city. They're not, in this case, initially targeting the production site. They're physically targeting the city itself. And then the second part of the raid is timed so that as the first responders are out putting fires out, you now have the second wave that comes across. And again, the idea is to render the civilian populace essentially impotent and incapable of continuing both production, but also pressuring, at this point, hopefully, in his mind anyway, pressuring Hitler and the regime for peace. Neither of those two things happens. And the results of the raid itself, it's difficult to determine the number of people actually killed, but it's in the neighborhood of 20,000. What this really becomes, though, is a propaganda coup for Germany, and in particular Goebbels. Goebbels inflates that number to over 200,000, and Dresden becomes another rallying cry for the continuance of the conflict. And it's interesting that, Harris would take this attitude and think that somehow the German people were different than the British people, because the Blitz did nothing but steal the resolve of the British population. Dresden essentially has the same effect on the German population, certainly when used by a master propagandist like Goebbels. But it is an interesting and intriguing question going forward to think about the efficacy, military or otherwise, and the morality of actually physically targeting civilians in the conception of and in the prosecution of total war. Slide, please. So, again, it is the Holocaust is never to be forgotten, and it certainly won't be as part of this presentation. But as you read through and as you study the Holocaust, it's one of the most difficult topics to study, just because of its emotive effect. But in particular, what I would like to discuss here is not only the savagery that the Holocaust represents, but some of the stories that get lost sometimes are the stories of the men who actually liberated the camps. These are men, and this is the liberation of the camps started with the liberation of Ohrdruf by the 89th Division on the 6th of April, 1945. There had been rumors. The Army was aware of the fact that these camps existed, but from the American side, the American military, the average GI had not experienced firsthand the depravity of the Nazi regime until Ohrdruf, and then the rest of the Buchenwald complex was liberated over the next 5 to 6 days, from the 6th to the 11th of April. And again, as you read through the diaries and the recollections and the emotional impact of the soldiers as they liberate these camps, it is difficult to not contemplate the sub-bullet that I put up here, Western civilization versus genocide, to come face to face with what the absolute depravity of an ideology, of a fascist ideology, can produce is beyond stunning. But it also becomes kind of the moral rallying point for a lot of troops. I think in some cases, troops were not necessarily sure or as to what they were fighting for, but in the aftermath of the liberation of the camps, there was absolutely no question as to why this was important, that America not only participate but be successful in this campaign, to be part of this alliance with the other free nations of the world, and to eradicate to the degree possible a Nazi or fascist ideology. For many GIs, and you have to remember a lot of these men, particularly in Patton's army, had gone through the Battle of the Bulge and had seen violence on a level that most of us will never experience. This to them was still, until the day they passed, and in interviews that you read with them, was still the most significant emotional event of their war, and really, as I said before, becomes the emotional punctuation mark of what this final push was truly about. Slide, please. So as we begin to wrap up the end of my part of the presentation, one of the things that becomes incredibly contentious is forced disposition as the war comes to a close. It becomes more and more apparent to the Allies on both sides, both the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain, that victory is not necessarily around the corner, but is definitely coming. So the question becomes, where should, at the end of hostilities, forces be? This becomes for Churchill a very significant part of his discussions certainly with General Eisenhower, and in the aftermath of the death of Franklin Roosevelt, with President Truman, with regards to where should these lines be drawn as the forces as the war comes to an end. But one of the other questions that arises, and one of many that Eisenhower had to debate, is who gets to, and that's kind of an odd way to say that, but who will be the first of the forces into Berlin? Because when the Russians begin their attack on Berlin, Allied forces are only 60 miles to the west. They have the equal ability to get there, and yet it's the Soviet Union that is given first right of attack, for lack of a better way of saying it. But it becomes, again, part of this post-war posturing. And what's interesting is that the Soviets tend to use their military much more in that fashion, to possess and occupy territory that they want to make sure that falls into their sphere of influence in the aftermath, whereas Eisenhower is still having to balance between military efficacy and the politics of the situation. And in the transition from President Roosevelt to President Truman, there is a vast amount of knowledge that is lost because, for the most part, FDR did not keep his vice president in the loop necessarily with regards to the discussions that had gone on at several of the peace conferences, and his relationship with Churchill and his relationship with Stalin. So that as Truman is forced to make these decisions, he's trying to do this almost in terms of a vacuum. So he has to rely really on his military advisors and and agreements that were made a year and a half, 2 years ago that didn't necessarily foresee exactly what the end of the war would look like. So what you'll see in the bottom left corner is really how this starts to unfold as we get to Berlin. The final piece to talk about with Berlin is it also represents the need for total victory. Total defeat is the only way to peace with Germany. And a lot of that has to do with Hitler, the Hitler cult, but it also is something that in the advent of total war is almost demanded from that level of warfare. If you're going to commit total war, if you're going to conduct total war, you need also to produce total victory, unconditional surrender. And the only way that's going to happen in Germany is with the fall of Berlin. Slide, please. So the final slide, if you look at the middle graphic at the top, this is essentially what ends up happening in the aftermath, and there'll be many more discussions after with this, and Dr. Goodman will cover Potsdam here in a moment. But one of the things that needs to be thought about in the aftermath of peace really is the bottom left corner, and that is you have a devastated Europe, and we'll talk about the Marshall Plan as we go on. But it has taken the absolute destruction of a lot of Germany to bring it to its knees. And to bring it to its knees really requires the unconditional surrender, and that the first of these unconditional surrenders happens at Rents on the 7th of May with General Jodl. Jodl initially tries to surrender only his Western forces because there is a tremendous fear on the part of the German military that if they surrender unconditionally on both fronts, the retribution that will be taken by the Soviet forces will be catastrophic. Eisenhower, though, insists. Jodl radios to Admiral Dönitz, who had taken over the leadership of what was left of the Reich in the aftermath of Hitler's death on the 30th of April, and lays out essentially what Eisenhower has told him. Either we surrender now, or Eisenhower will lock the front, and none of the soldiers, the German soldiers, will no longer be given quarter and not be able to surrender to the Western powers. Dönitz radios back, and on the 7th, Jodl signs the first of the unconditional surrenders of Germany. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Goodman.
Thank you, Woody. I'll get my visuals up there in just a moment. I'm going to start in January of 1944 with the liberation of Leningrad. And go, next slide, please, Chris. It was lifted on January 27th after almost 900 days of siege. Germans arrived in September of 1941, and after virtually 900 days plus and 800,000 civilian deaths, mostly due to starvation, disease, exposure, and constant bombardment. But that is actually the lowest figure that I came across. It's not hard to find other figures. You have to take statistics on the Eastern Front with a certain, plus or minus 20% kind of consideration. Not that there was a real effort to inflate or deflate some of these statistics, but they were very, very hard to keep. And in any case, at least 800,000 civilian deaths. And that number actually is more than the total mortality of both the United States and Great Britain during the entire war, even that lower number. And so what we have there is an opening up, pushing back the Germans and to some extent their Finnish allies. Finland is a whole story in itself. They were very reluctant allies of the Germans. The last I'll have to say about Finland. But at this point, we have a situation across this 1,000+ mile front on the east where virtually all of the Soviet victories, Moscow, now Leningrad, Kursk, Stalingrad, and the Caucasus, places that John mentioned in his earlier talk, all of them were essentially defensive victories, followed by very limited offenses. And these offenses were limited at least partly because of the bloodletting that took place in the defensive victories. And the inability of the Soviets were exhausted. And also they had this inability to sustain logistically an offensive that went beyond what they were able to do, which again was very limited. A lot of people died in these limited offenses, but now coming the summer of 1944, next slide please, the Soviets were going to get to act together like nothing before in Operation Bagration. This was the beginning of the sustained Soviet offensives that would bring the war to an end. It started June 22nd, 1944. Much has been made that is exactly and symbolically 3 years after the German attack in 1941. That really wasn't quite planned. The initial thought for actually launching Bagration was supposed to be earlier, but it worked out well to have it on the 3-year anniversary. And this was, in some people's minds, the big Soviet offensive to help take the pressure off of our offensive in Normandy. And Normandy, of course, was the offensive to take the pressure off of the Soviets that Stalin had been asking for since 1942. But as we're going to see, by the time Normandy took place, the Soviets didn't need that second front anywhere near the extent that they did earlier. So Bagration was on a scale and with an intent that dwarfed anything before on even the Eastern Front. The Soviets had 12 army groups lined up from the north to the south along a 1,000+ mile front. Bagration would involve really 4, but in some ways 5, and in other ways more than 5 of these army groups. And the intent was to essentially destroy Army Group Center of the Germans. And would end up, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment, end up tearing a 250-mile wide hole in the German front. And over the course of the month after launching this attack, it would obliterate 25 German divisions, completely obliterate. Next slide, please. So here is a less detailed, I'm going to go to a little bit more detailed map following this. But there are actually 11 of the 12 army groups. The Karelian Army Group, which is actually opposite Finland, is not shown here. So the Soviets have those 11 army groups, and the 4 in the middle are going after that salient. It'll become more apparent in the next map of Army Group Center. And the intent is nothing less than essentially crippling Army Group Center so that it is no longer an effective force. Certainly not one that can take any kind of offensive action, and would be very hard-pressed defensively. And next slide, please. Chris? Okay, there's more detail. Don't strain your eyes, but let me explain a little bit about how to read a map like this. The division among ground forces is the basic complete unit for World War II. It is complete in the sense that it has its own artillery, its own transport, its own medical, all these kinds of troops that make the division something of an entity unto itself. Divisions would be combined, 2 or more would be in what is called a corps. Most of you are familiar with this, but let me remind you. 2 or more corps would be an army, and all the major combatants were organized. 2 or more armies would be an army group. And you can tell these by the number of little X's above the boxes that describe these organizations, these military organizations. The division has 2 little X's over it. In some way, usually divisions are commanded in the US and Britain by major generals, and that's 2 stars. A corps with 3 X's is 3 stars. An army, 4 X's. An army group, which remember is 2 or more armies, has 5 stars. And you see there, actually, I think all 12 of the Soviet army groups on this front are shown here. And the four in the middle, two each under Zhukov and Vasilevsky, are going to be at the heart of Operation Bagration. Now, what they are going to go after, with 1.7 million men, 2,700 tanks, 24,000 artillery pieces, and enough logistical support, and we'll get to that in just a minute, so that they can sustain an offensive in a way that they were not capable of sustaining in the previous years since the German attack in June of 1941. And they're going to go after that bulge, that great bulge that you see there. And by the time they are finished, that whole gray area, okay, you're going to see some of the more southern army groups get into the picture. So they eliminate German positions in the lower part of the gray. But it's that core of four plus one more above that army groups that are going to take out most of that gray army, that gray area that is occupied by mostly Army Group Center for the Germans. They're going to launch this attack June 22nd, 1944. And when they are finished, when they have to sort of draw up, they actually made more progress more quickly than even they thought they could do. But when they're finished and they draw up and for a variety of reasons before they launch their next big offensive, this is like the greatest offensive of the entire war. Next slide, please. One of the reasons the Soviets were able to sustain this is that they solved a good deal of their logistical problems. Part of their problems is that after the frontline troops, after the combat troops moved forward, either had a breakthrough or just simply pushed the enemy back, they had trouble getting supplies up to sustain those offensives. Food and ammunition, fuel, the kinds of supplies that were necessary for mobile warfare. By this time in the war, on both the Eastern and Western fronts, the Allies, the Soviets on the Eastern Front, the Americans and the British and some of the French and the Poles and a few others, basically were much more mobile than their German enemies. And one of the main reasons for that is the 2.5-ton truck. Pictured here is the Studebaker model. Ultimately, about 220,000 of these Studebaker trucks were manufactured in the U.S. out of a total of 800,000 2.5-ton trucks made by other manufacturers as well. This one has kind of an elongated front. It isn't the one you see most often in various pictures. But these 2.5-ton trucks, which the Soviets for the most part turned into 3.5-ton trucks, it refers to their carrying load, were able essentially to go back and forth and bring up the various supplies that made a sustained offensive possible logistically. So we have these 2.5-ton trucks in large numbers, about 100,000 of them. Next slide, please. Were sent to the Soviets, mostly via the Persian corridor. Most people think that Lend-Lease, what we sent to the Soviet Union, came through the Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Archangel. But there's a whole lot of stuff sent through the Persian corridor, including 100,000 of these 2.5-ton trucks and 50,000 1/4-ton trucks, which is actually the official name of the Jeeps. And they were shipped to the USSR, and the Soviets had enough of all of this stuff by the summer of 1944 to launch, not only launch, but carry through Bagration and essentially keep that kind of unbelievable pressure. Okay? This is not a blitzkrieg in reverse. This is like a steamroller across what was and would continue to be something on the order of a 1,000-mile front. Next slide, please. That's actually a picture of once the ships were unloaded. The ships could be brought fairly safely to Persia, Iran, and unloaded, and the roads were good enough, as you can see in this picture. These are not 2.5-ton trucks; they're actually something else. But there was this constant stream of vehicles that went through the Persian corridor up to the Soviet Union, and did a lot to make their big offensives logistically possible. Next slide, please. Okay, what follows Bagration? Not Bagration, that's what most Americans call it, Bagration, named after actually a Napoleonic Russian general, who was actually interested in the Soviets chose to use this. He was of royal blood, but whatever. In any case, the next big offensive was going to come later in the year, and there was going to be a Baltic component to it and a Balkans, if you'd like, component to it. It's a bit broader than just the Balkans. And what you see here is a map similar to the one I showed you before for Bagration, for those offensives that actually bring 1944 to an end. December 1944, you may remember from Woody's talk, was the Battle of the Bulge. But the Bulge, which was a very, very serious thing from our standpoint, certainly for the American soldiers who were there, was again on a smaller scale. But take a look at this, again, without straining your eyes. And we have these 12 army groups, they're still there. The German forces had various forces that look like armies, look like corps, look like army groups, but they were very, very depleted by the end of 1944. The Soviets managed to maintain their strength. They didn't have infinite population resources, but they had enough to pretty much sustain operationally the various units that you see pictured there. And let me point out something in particular with regard to this, and that is by December of 1944, the Germans had pretty much lost all of its allies, partly as a result of these two campaigns that I'm showing you here, where the Baltic countries, they were independent countries before the Stalin-Hitler Pact in 1939. They became part of the Soviet Union as part of the agreement after that. So the three Baltic states were actually Soviet republics, and in fact remained Soviet republics till the end of the Soviet Union. And they basically changed sides. To some extent, they were Soviet, and then when the Germans came through, particularly in Lithuania, they became pro-German. But in any case, they are no longer part of the areas that the Germans controlled. Finland basically caves in. You can't see that on this map. Finland, it's again an interesting story. Very reluctant ally of the Germans. They were not a very good ally of the Germans, to be perfectly honest. But they had all sorts of problems with the Soviet Union. They didn't have much choice. But they basically got out of the war by this time. And the countries you see in the gray area at the bottom in the south, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, which had been allies of the Germans, and which had, in fact, lent troops, they had troops as part of the various German offensives in the east. They got out of the war as well. At this stage of the game, Germany largely stands alone. Okay, and the Soviets are sort of lined up at that far red line for their final push, and they were going to, as Woody has pointed out, ultimately end up taking Berlin. Next slide, please. Now, one of the features of the war in the East that didn't exist in the war in the West was urban warfare. I mean, really serious ground urban warfare in large cities. The U.S., the Brits, the French avoided that. Closest the U.S. ever actually got to serious urban warfare in a large city was going to be Manila in the Philippines in the Pacific Theater. But that's something we're going to talk about when we do the Asia Pacific version of this. But the various larger cities in the West, most notably Paris, they basically, Paris went in 1940 and then again in 1944 without very much conflict. There was not much in the way of serious urban warfare in any of the other cities of Western Europe, but there was a lot in the East. And I list 6 cities there that, notice Prague is not there. Prague actually came through the war fairly unscathed in many ways. But the 6 cities listed there went through tremendous forms of urban warfare that cost the Soviets and the Germans dearly. I mean, dearly. I talked a little bit about the siege of Leningrad. The Germans and their allies never really got into Leningrad. They got very close. Leningrad was never totally cut off. There was some supply over Lake Ladoga, when it was frozen in particular. But all the others had terrible street-to-street fighting. Stalingrad and Berlin being the most serious. And ultimately, the war ended with the Soviets going house to house, street to street, through Berlin at tremendous cost. Tremendous cost to their soldiers, to the German soldiers, and especially to civilians. Civilians in all 6 of these cities. Kiev basically was a two-way. The Germans took it on their way east. The Soviets took it back on their way west. These cities and the surrounding areas, which had fairly significant populations, I mean, really significant populations, suffered tremendously. By the time they were liberated, let's say, they were virtually completely destroyed. A couple of them, Berlin in particular, got beaten up fairly badly by Allied bombing. But Berlin was a really big place. The Allied bombing didn't do as much damage as associated with Dresden, which Woody talked about, or Hamburg before that, or some of the other German cities. But the Soviets coming through really made a tremendous mess at huge cost. The Allies, the Western Allies, the Brits and Americans in particular, tried very, very hard to avoid this kind of urban warfare. And in the U.S. in particular, in both the European Atlantic theaters and the Asia Pacific theaters, managed to almost completely avoid it, again with the exception, which we'll argue was perhaps unnecessary, of Manila in the Pacific. But one of the things that disturbed us with regard to ending the war in the Pacific was the thought of this kind of urban warfare in Japan. Next slide, please. So there were a whole bunch of meetings, mostly taking place in the East, that brought the war to an end. And I will list them here. And we'll end up talking about Potsdam, and that will be sort of a lead in to the next session that we're going to have on tomorrow. But I'll just make a few comments here. Tehran in Persia, in Iran, Stalin had to be part of all of these things, either directly or indirectly. I mean, he wasn't part of a lot of meetings that took place between Churchill and Stalin just would not travel very far. Among other things, he was scared to death of flying. But he did manage to get down to Tehran. And apparently that took some doing. Yalta, of course, was held within the Soviet Union. The 2 German unconditional military surrenders are sort of peculiar. The one in Reims, which is in France, and Woody talked about that, and that surrender did not satisfy the Soviets, not by a long shot. And they wanted a surrender on German territory, and they wanted it at a higher level, and they wanted it in the most total. I mean, the surrender on the 7th was total, but not like what happened on the 8th. And the surrender on May 8th, which is now generally accepted as if you like, VE Day militarily for the war in Europe, was presided over by Georgy Zhukov, Marshal Zhukov, who you saw appear in Bagration. Actually, Zhukov appears in everything. Zhukov goes back, actually, he was the commander of Soviet forces at the battle with the Japanese in 1939 that John referred to briefly, Kholkhin Gol, or Nomonhan, which is the term the Japanese usually use for it. So Zhukov was the winning commander there, and he was the winning commander taking Berlin. And he was virtually everywhere in between. Zhukov had the most totally remarkable military career over the entire 1939 to 1945 period. Potsdam essentially really ended the war. Potsdam, in a sense, was the equivalent, or the closest counterpart, equivalent's not the right word, of Versailles after World War I. And this time, Germany was going to surrender unconditionally. By the way, this is a term that Roosevelt rather unilaterally introduced at the Casablanca conference, actually surprised the Brits there, French for that matter, and referring to General Grant and the American Civil War. It turns out only Germany surrendered really unconditionally, and pushing that had good reason, because the armistice in 1918 that ended the killing on the Western Front for World War I turned out not to be enough to stop Germany from basically complaining that they got a raw deal at Versailles and they didn't really surrender, and so on and so forth in the 1920s leading up to Hitler. But there was going to be no doubt about it, and there was not going to be a Versailles at Potsdam. Only the three countries that were most responsible for the total defeat of Germany, namely the Soviet Union, the US, and Britain, were there. The thing about Potsdam is the change, if you like, of the relative status of the principles there. This was, Roosevelt had died in April of 45. Truman became president, and here it is in July that he's basically meeting at the conference that's going to divide up the Europe after the war, among various other things. And Churchill actually gets replaced as Prime Minister of Britain during the course of this conference, and his successor, Clement Attlee, is there at Potsdam as well. And only Stalin, who was really on top of things at Potsdam, and as the real veteran of this thing in ways that Attlee and Truman were not, really became, not just came into his own, but was really, if you like, the primary participant. Potsdam, we'll get to this in our next symposium, is also where, in July of 45, the U.S. exploded an atomic bomb, and this was hinted at, except that Stalin sort of knew about it anyway, during Potsdam, and this is talked about sort of endlessly. Potsdam basically covered how to end the war, the occupation and partition of Eastern Europe, the partition of Germany, ultimately the partition of Berlin within the partition of Germany. I mean, Eisenhower was right not to risk so many casualties to take Berlin, because we got our piece of Berlin anyway, and then we had to, in a sense, fight for it later. Phil Breedlove is going to talk about that tomorrow, or and perhaps on Wednesday as well. But one of the sort of final agreements, kind of quid pro quo, was that the Soviets would come into the war against Japan after a certain period of time. And they actually kept up to that. That was, they were telling us that we had to start a second front to relieve them from 1942 onward. And we were calling for another front against Japan. In the last year of the war, the Japanese army was really quite intact on the Asian mainland, numbering millions of troops. And we didn't relish the idea of dealing with that. I mean, we were doing just fine with our island hopping and with the naval and air war in the Pacific. But the idea of putting scores of divisions on the ground in Asia to deal with the Japanese army there really was not terribly appetizing. And so for some time we had been trying to get the Soviets basically to put all their troops after the war ended in Europe on trains and take them all the way out to the Pacific and do a lot of that dirty work with the Japanese army. And that was more or less decided at Potsdam. And with that, I think I am finished. Grace, you want to take the Q&A?
This first question comes from Marsha Waldstreicher. For any of the speakers, do you believe that Operation Bodyguard made D-Day a much more Pyrrhic victory than it had to be? Did Hitler's paranoia over the invasion location make taking the beaches of Normandy so much harder?
I'll be the first to try to field this one. The first part of the question with regards to Operation Bodyguard, I think if you look at certainly the conversations that were held between Rommel, Rundstedt, Hitler, Guderian, the Bodyguard, I think, was successful in obfuscating potentially where the Allies would land. So I think from that, it was a facilitator with regards to Normandy. But I think more to the point, it caused enough confusion, and I'll kind of tie this to a partial answer to your second question with regards to Hitler's paranoia. I think it played well into his paranoia. He was sure that it would come, and depending on who you read, he was kind of in agreement with Rommel that it would probably come on the Conundrum. But given the uncertainty and quite honestly his paranoia over anyone other than himself commanding forces in the West, this is one of the reasons that he partitioned up the command structure of those 10 divisions I was talking about. If that had been unified, and this is really what Rommel was pushing for just before D-Day, if they had been unified under Rommel, this would have been a very different campaign, I think, and the toeholds would have been much, much more difficult to hold, day 2, D-Day plus 2, 3, and 4, than they were otherwise because of, again, it took a long time for the Panzer reserves that were held north, and they were held kind of in a position where they could respond to Calais vice the Constantin. Had those been able to be brought to bear early on, it would have been a very different war. So I think in general, Bodyguard was an aid, and I think Hitler's paranoia, in some ways, it's, there's always a discussion between the strengths of a coalition versus a unitary command structure. In the case of Hitler, he basically had locked out all inputs from his subordinates. But with regards to the Allies, you're forced to listen to everybody else, and I think that actually ends up being a strength in this case.
I would only observe that we always have to remember that there was still 300,000 German soldiers up in Norway who stayed there for the rest of the war until finally, almost at the very end, they are brought back and essentially captured because they don't play any role. So the Germans were concerned enough about the entire extent of the Western Front. I fully agree with Woody's statement in terms of the position. But you've got an additional 300,000 fellows up there who are basically skiing merrily while the whole war goes on and doing nothing. They've been doing nothing since they took the territory.
Okay, great. This next one is from Robert Thornton, and it's directed towards you, Dr. Morrow. Do you believe Montgomery received too much credit for his actions, particularly in North Africa? And he references the Desert Generals and Barnett.
You would throw Montgomery at me. First, let me say that Montgomery is not one of my favorite characters. All right. I shall try to be as unbiased as possible. Montgomery has the benefit of actually being the only British general, since others have been dismissed. Later on, Bill Slim, China, Burma, India theater, would gain an excellent reputation as the war continued in 44-45. But Montgomery appears at the perfect time in North Africa when the British are finally getting their supplies together and enough soldiers and in particular equipment. Americans are shipping Sherman tanks to them. The early Shermans, we don't have much regard for them often in the Northwest European campaign, but the Shermans of 42 were really top of the line with a 75 millimeter gun. And so Montgomery takes over, and his fundamental reputation was as a superb trainer of men. And this is very important in the North African campaign. He has the troops, he has the munitions, he actually outweighs Rommel in terms of power. But at the same time, you see in North Africa something that's going to occur with Montgomery throughout the rest of the war. And he plans his operations very carefully, but to a certain extent is very on the uptake to move or change his operations should need be. So he does well in completing the war in North Africa as they drive across the continent. But what you keep seeing with Montgomery is this incredibly prickly personality, and this is what Woody was talking about. It's like, my God, to have to deal with Montgomery and then Patton, the two ultimate prima donnas. Eisenhower no wonder Eisenhower smoked like a chimney, because it was enough to have to deal with these two characters. But the thing is that Operation Market Garden, which Woody pointed out very well, is a perfect example of Montgomery in his decision that he really should be the one to win the war, and drawing up this plan that even his top intelligence officer said to him, sir, don't you think this is an overreach? We're going to go on this one narrow road through Belgium, and we're going to go across the Rhine, and we're going to jump these 3 bridges with paratroopers. And they actually had photographs of these Tiger tanks and German anti-tank guns that they'd taken from Spitfires at low level. And these guys are just waiting for Montgomery's forces to come to delay them. And so he launches them. And of course, the British I do have to love the British in many respects because they actually are very regular. They're like the German counterparts. The Germans always bomb you at the same time as say during the day. The British always take tea in the afternoon. And so they would invariably stop, and people would be saying, you got paratroopers out there, those bridges you got. Well, we still have to have our tea. So ultimately, a number of the paratroopers are captured. The Poles are practically slaughtered. The British go into POW camps. The Americans were able to pull theirs off on them. But it's not a very good plan, because he forgets that he actually needed to liberate the Scheldt so that Antwerp could be used as a decent port. That was the emphasis. That was the one thing he had to do, and he didn't do it. So his generalship, I have always questioned, because I think his penchant was to try to bring all attention on himself. And in that sense, he really is very much like Patton. But he's not a slasher like Patton. Patton likes to go on the move quick, fast, although he gets held up at Metz. But Montgomery is just very, very plotting. And part of this, I think, comes from one. But he is the best general that the British had. They cannot afford to get rid of him. Although Churchill actually was thinking about getting rid of him when he hadn't seized Caen in France after the invasion, D-Day, because it's taking him so long to get his act together. And Eisenhower actually had to talk Churchill out of it. So as much as Ike had a problem with Montgomery, Churchill was actually done with him after a certain point.
Great, thank you, sir. This next question is from Dave Johnson, and it's directed towards Dr. Goodman. Why was France excluded from the group of victors at Potsdam? Or is that a subject for discussion tomorrow?
Well, that's a subject. Hey, Dave, good hearing from you. France, throughout this, after its defeat in 1940, certainly in North Africa, was very complicated. We had problems figuring out who to deal with France. And the Allies, Brits and the Americans in particular, spent more time thinking about Italy and getting Italy out of the war than they thought about getting France back into the war. And de Gaulle, who had a certain amount of credibility as a fighter who even in 1940 did well in the battlefield, but as an uncompromising Francophile, ways that lots of other Frenchmen, particularly those in the French Navy and what have you in North Africa. And sort of de Gaulle kept insisting that he be a kind of an equal partner. This oversimplifies things. And he got to the point, if you want to talk about people getting fed up with Montgomery, absolutely nobody was going to Gaulle. And the bottom line with regard to Yalta, I mean, they basically threw him a big fish for various reasons. I mean, it was really important that and Woody alluded to this, that the French basically liberate Paris and be part of the post-Normandy push. But militarily, they didn't do that much. And de Gaulle was very big on symbolism. And he was abrasive to the point of being intolerable in many ways. And when it came to Potsdam, or to Yalta, or to what have you, the big three just gave France no credibility. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but it's not far from being an oversimplification. I mean, Stalin in particular could ask, Churchill was France's major proponent, at least partly because he figured after the war the U.S. would pull out. They would need a revitalized France to help deal with the Soviet Union. It turns out the U.S. didn't pull out to anywhere near that extent. But none of the other three wanted de Gaulle there. They didn't. I mean, it was a fairly big deal. And Stalin was okay with it as long as the French part of the partition of Germany and Berlin came out of the hides of the U.S. and Great Britain. But God, I just cannot imagine Stalin having any truck whatsoever with de Gaulle. And de Gaulle held this against everybody for the rest of his life. But arguably, and this gets into an understanding of France, Vicky might address this tomorrow, an understanding of France that basically argues that he was very important in keeping France from leaning too far towards the communists after the end of the war. Woody, John, do you want to add to that?
I think the only thing I would add is even. Oh, go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you're absolutely correct about, they used to call de Gaulle l'asperge, the asparagus, because of his nose, but yeah, totally antagonistic. I would recall, though, that the French Expeditionary Corps, 2 Moroccan divisions, served and fought very well in the mountains around in Italy. And then the French in the south, France, a very, very southern with Jacob Devers, did move into Germany at the most southernmost point. But the funny thing about it was that at every point when there was a question about retreating and giving up Metz to the Germans, when the Germans were on the, and we're thinking about, we got to pull out of here so we can come out somewhere else. And de Gaulle is, we're not going anywhere. If you want to think you're going anywhere, we're not. So, we're stuck with them. But you're absolutely right, Woody.
So the only thing I was going to add is even in the initial conceptions of the United Nations, Roosevelt gave France no quarter. The Big Four it would have been the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and actually China under Chiang Kai-shek. There was absolutely no discussion of France being one of the veto powers on what became eventually the UN Security Council either. So there was not a lot of love lost between Roosevelt and de Gaulle either. So even after Truman took over, the chances of France actually inserting itself back into that process were pretty low.
Right. So this next question, it comes from Mike, and this is for anybody. What are your thoughts on the Western Allies abandoning Poland to the Soviets? Was FDR too inclined to give Stalin his way?
Go ahead, John.
Okay. There may be a difference of opinion. I think my fundamental perspective here is that there was nothing we could have done about Poland. We do understand that the Soviets, when they paused to refit outside of Warsaw, perhaps might have been able to take Warsaw on the fly, which they'd been doing, but they chose to wait, probably more for political reasons, because Stalin wanted the Polish Home Army, which was tied to England. If they decided they were going to rise up, then England was going to have to take care of them. And at the same time, there was not going to be any help from the Soviets, nor was there going to be any aid that could be put in there by shuttle raids or anything like that would land in the Soviet Union. But I think once the situation ends with the Soviet Union and its forces in control of Eastern Europe, there was not a single thing we could have done. I always loved the Patton movie when George C. Scott was a better Patton than Patton was, because he's got a better voice. But, give me this and give me that, and I'll kick them all the way back into the Soviet Union. That wasn't going to happen. And so in some respects, I think there's an assumption there that's really not correct, and that is that we had a choice. Eisenhower made the right decision in letting the Russians take Berlin. If you watch the memoirs of American soldiers at that time, they are all cheering the Russians on. Let them take Berlin. We don't want to get killed driving that additional distance, because the Russians suffered huge losses. Maybe we wouldn't have. I don't think the Germans would have capitulated to us, absolutely. But they suffered huge losses taking Berlin. But the point is that it was done. The die was cast. War was over. There was no way we were going to be able to do anything for Poland. And then sometimes there are arguments about Hungary in '56. Should we have gone and done something for them? And it's like the same thing. Do you really want a nuclear war with the Soviet Union over Hungary? I've actually heard that argument waged by diplomats. So I think that would be my perspective.
Let me add to what John has just said. Given that we didn't come to ground in northern France until June 6th of 1944, and there was no conceivable way that we could get to any part of Poland before the Soviets, and to some extent at their leisure, as John pointed out, could get there. And I mean, we would have had to have landed like in 1943 to have made that happen, and that just was not going to happen. And the Soviets were going to get there with all these army groups, with land forces that could not be countered that far inland by whatever tactical air superiority or strategic air superiority that we had. So there was just no way we were going to get there first. And even if we got there in time to fight with them, and the argument could be made we could have done that in Czechoslovakia, but not in Poland. That's all there is to it. And the Soviets took their time with Warsaw to make sure that the opposition to if you'd like, Soviet or communist control of Poland got beaten up fairly quickly. I mean, the Polish fighters in Warsaw had delusions if they thought they were going to take Poland and offer it as some kind of deal to Stalin. That was just not going to happen. And the Poles who in Britain, of that government in exile, who Churchill tried to accommodate, at least to some extent, they were completely out of the picture. And even Churchill, basically, when he divvied up, had this famous little note with Stalin on dividing up things, couldn't really make any case whatsoever with Poland. Czechoslovakia is a different story, though. But it went the way it went. But I think at least John and I'm sure Woody, are in complete agreement on Poland.
So this question comes from David Squire and is directed towards everybody. After the surrender of the Italians and Mussolini's demise, was the Italian military, army, air force, navy of any significant assist to the Allied campaign through the country?
No. Next question.
Okay, Dr. Goodman, this is from Firuz, and it's directed at you. It is important to note that Iran declared neutrality and nevertheless was forced by the Soviet Union and Britain to cooperate. How important was the Persian Corridor for the Soviet Union?
It's important that Iran-Persia, I mean, it was still called Persia for a fair amount of this time, that Persia didn't go with the Germans, and there was really virtually no chance of that happening. Given that there was no counter to the U.S. or Britain or the Soviets making use of Iran to whatever extent they wanted to, there was nothing that Iran could do. I mean, they didn't really, it served no purpose whatsoever for them to piss off the U.S. or Britain or the Soviets, who, if they got pissed off, could actually make life a bit miserable for Iran. Frankly, to be perfectly blunt about it, if you'd like, the income from British and American and Soviet operations, mostly British and American operations in Iran, didn't hurt their economy whatsoever. And they got to pick up a bunch of the surplus that was there at the end of the war.
Great. So this one is from Gary Lindsay, and he asks, had Hitler invaded the Soviet Union 2 to 3 months earlier to take advantage of the warmer weather, would the outcome have been different?
That's another one. I love these what ifs. They always keep it. They appear so frequently, especially with regard to the Eastern Front. They didn't. Obviously, Hitler had to deal with the Balkans. There were other things that he had to straighten up. But let's take the question as it stands. With an invasion, which wasn't going to happen 2 to 3 months earlier, presumption is that he might have gotten to Moscow before the winter did. In the original descriptions of Barbarossa, it looked as though, and I think I mentioned this, that the Germans had actually were doing very well when they got to Moscow, but it was the winter that ultimately stopped them. And then the infusion of troops, often the infusion of troops from the east, is neglected or played down, but it's a disaster. But the latest accounts of Barbarossa indicate that the Germans were taking, first of all, serious losses, much higher losses than they had taken in the Western campaign. They were unexpected. They were losing troops at probably about the rate of 25,000 men killed a month, which was just far more. And these are the most skilled soldiers. I mean, the operations are going well. They were also encountering they hit things like the T-34 tank or some of the huge KV tanks, and they don't really have a weapon to deal with those. Panzer IVs are neither as fast nor as maneuverable, plus the T-34 has a far lower profile and wider tracks, so it's highly maneuverable in any kind of weather, whereas German tanks just bogged down. But if you read the more recent descriptions of Barbarossa, what's happening is that logistics are killing the Germans all the way through the Barbarossa campaign. They never had enough trucks. Most people forget that the German army basically moved east on foot with horses, including a lot of their artillery. They had this tremendous armored spearhead, but behind it, the average soldier walked in, and many of the artillery pieces were pulled by horses, which is the weather got cold, we're not going to survive either. So what you see is the dust, because all the French roads were paved. That was perfect for armored warfare. Soviet Union, dust, fouling the filters. Tanks are breaking down at a rapid rate. What trucks they have, because I said they're not even standardized, so they have a heck of a time repairing them, are breaking down. They are losing more men than they expected. And even when they close off the first great, what they call Kessel, this great encirclement, a lot of Soviet troops, they may have captured all these millions of men gradually, but a lot of Soviet troops actually escaped. Some of them because their commanders just ran out on them and they bugged out too. But the other problem was that the Germans weren't quite capable of closing those cauldrons the way they had been able to do it in the West. And so what you see is this gradual deterioration of the German army the closer it gets to Moscow. And then what you would have had to account for is that you get there 2 or 3 months earlier.